break built into that session. I just want to again say one more time, if your car is parked in the EMT lot on the grass, you are in big trouble and you better go move it right away. So please do that. I've heard that is a no-no, so please go take care of that. Before I welcome our panel, the other thing I just want to remind everyone is to please turn off your cell phones so that they are not ringing or pinging during the panel discussion. So thank you so much. And one last reminder, immediately following this panel, all of our authors will move to the book signing tent, and you can go and buy their books over at the Bunch of Grapes tent and then move with them over to the book signing tent to have the books signed. So welcome to our panel. We're very happy to have you here. Thank you. Our fourth panel of the day is titled Out of Place in America, Marginalized Identities, with Nicholas Boggs, Martha Jones, Joseph Lee, Danzy, Senna, and moderated by Michele Norris. Drawing on works of memoir, fiction, and biography, these remarkable authors will lead us in an exploration of how questions of identity and belonging defy, challenge, and define the American experience. Nicholas Boggs is the author of Baldwin, A Love Story, the first major biography of the iconic figure in over 3 decades. A 3-time MacDowell Fellow, Boggs is the recipient of multiple grants and fellowships, including most recently the 2023 Whiting Creative Nonfiction Grant, and is the 2025 Johns Hopkins Fellow. Martha S. Jones is a historian and author of The Trouble of Color, an American Family Memoir, a deeply personal exploration of identity, lineage, and race in America. She is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor and a Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University. A prize-winning author of Vanguard and 3 other books, she is a leading voice on the race, law, and citizenship. Joseph Lee is an award-winning Aquina Wampanoag. Did I say it right? Yes, thank you. Journalist and author of Nothing More of This Land, Community Power and the Search for Indigenous Identity, which weaves personal narrative with investigative reporting to explore what it means to be Native today. He is a former Senior Indigenous Affairs Fellow at GRIST and Margins Fellow at the Asian American Writers Workshop. He teaches creative writing and holds an MFA from Columbia. Danzy Senna is a best-selling author known for her keen perceptions, biting humor, and satirical style. I love that. She has written 6 books, including Caucasia and New People. Her most recent work, Colored Television, continues to push boundaries, blending personal and societal narratives to address issues of race and representation. Senna teaches writing at the University of Southern California. And our moderator, Michele Norris, is a senior contributor for senior contributing editor for MSNBC, and a member of the Peabody Awards Board of Directors. She is the author of the New York Times best-selling book, Our Hidden Conversations: What Americans Really Think About Race and Identity. She's the host of a podcast, Your Mama's Kitchen, and a former columnist for the Washington Post opinion section. Her voice will be familiar, as it is to me, to followers of public radio, where from 2002 to 2012, she was the host of NPR's afternoon magazine show, All Things Considered. And she also serves on the Martha's Vineyard Book Festival Advisory Board. So thank you for moderating, and thank you to our panelists.
And thank you all for being here on a beautiful day, because you could be at the beach, but we're so glad that you're here. I feel so very fortunate to be moderating a panel with these 4 magnificent books that are all so different, but all in conversation with each other in a really interesting way. And I had an experience that I actually invite all of you to do, which is to read them in tandem. Like, I didn't read them sequentially. I just sort of picked them up. And so it was this conversation that was coming at me at 4 different directions. Nicholas, your book is, how many pages is it?
Just 700 or
okay,
so.
So yours was the brick, and the other books were like the mortars. When I was in this assignment. But they really are beautiful, beautiful books, and I encourage you to think about reading them in quite that way. And I want to begin with the titles of the books, because the titles of the books all are beautiful and interesting, but they also speak to some of the themes I think we're going to touch on today. So love, trouble, land, and television. And television, not just television per se, but the stories that we tell ourselves and how important they are. So in the beginning, I always think it's an interesting conversation about how you land on a title. There's always, as an author, a story behind the title and the cover. We're going to leave the cover aside. But if you all four could just say a word about how you landed on the title for your book. And Nicholas, I'm going to begin with you.
Well, first of all, thanks for having us here. And also, today is James Baldwin's 101st birthday. So, many people love James Baldwin, and my love for him began when I was very young, growing up in Washington, D.C. I saw his photo, a picture of him on my 8th grade English teacher's wall. And then recently I spoke to her and she told me, no, actually, Nick, you got dressed up in a suit and gave a presentation on him about his life in 8th grade, which I completely repressed.
Oh, so, you were that kid, man, yeah.
So that was the beginning. And then in terms of the book itself, I discovered an out-of-print children's book by Baldwin in 1996 at the Beinecke. And it turns out, it's a long story, but the illustrator of the book was a French artist who everybody thought was deceased, but I tracked him down in Paris, and he was Baldwin's last great love. And in that experience, I sort of came to understand many years later that all of Baldwin's work was about love, but his love life, right? And I mean that in an expansive sense, like romantic, but also to mentors, to collaborators. It hadn't really been told that there were these gaps. So it grew very slowly into a love story.
Thank you for that. That is really, really beautiful. And you have to follow that now.
Yes. I'm sitting here thinking about love.
Which is a central part of your story also.
It is. It really is. I think in writing a family memoir, for me at least, one of the struggles was to arrive at love for everyone in the story. Which is more evident, I think, for ancestors who were at a distance from us and were raised to know and admire, but the ancestors closer to us, like parents, are tougher. So thanks for bringing the word love. But I'll talk about trouble and the trouble of color. This is a family memoir across 6 generations, asking questions about color, race, skin, family, who we call kin. Maybe the term trouble is self-evident in that. You don't have to know a lot about my family. If you know anything about our collective American family, you know that there's a lot of trouble that runs through that kind of story. But in this book, trouble has 2 meanings. And the second meaning comes from a spiritual, wade in the water. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's going to trouble the waters. And that comes from the book of John, which is actually an extremely hopeful, healing message to us about how when we step into the troubled waters, we are healed and made whole. So I think there's a double meaning in the title, and it is a way of capturing for me what was the kind of healing that came from stepping into the troubled waters of a family and coming out on the other side.
I think we should hold on to that, because we'll probably return to the notion of stepping into the troubled waters, because we're in the current right now, and we're experiencing riptides, and the inclination may be to step out of the water, and get away from that, because that's what we're told, but we have to figure out how to lean into it a little bit more. So we'll return to that. Joseph?
Yeah, thank you. So my title, Nothing More of This Land, is actually from basically a colonial era document written by one of our old tribal leaders. And it's this phrase from this document where he's describing what the community needs to do to hold on to the land that we have. And at the time when I first encountered the phrase, I found it really haunting and kind of like this warning and reminder, like passed down from ancestor to ancestor through the generations. But I also sort of didn't understand it, like nothing more of this land. Like, do we have nothing? Like, what's the relationship between us and the land and the nothingness? And I think at first I was like, I can't, use this as a title without fully understanding it. But I think as I worked through the book and the reporting and the research, I came to this place where I appreciated that sort of vagueness and ambiguity, because I think that's like the essential question. And your point about the double meaning, I think, is really important, because it's sort of this open, ongoing question of, well, what do we do with the land, and what is our relationship with the land and each other? And so I kind of really actually came to love that part of it, and leaving the title as like this open question rather than what I had originally read it as, which was this sort of declarative, like definitive, all or nothing statement. So I kind of tried to lean into that.
Thank you.
So my novel, Colored Television, kind of came out of my experience as a novelist of literary fiction living in Los Angeles for 20 years, and which can oftentimes feel like you're an Amish person, because people think when you go to a party, they think that's sort of quaint and interesting that you're still writing books and novels, and they often, the first question you get asked is, have your books been made into anything? And when you say a book, they just stare at you blankly. So I was really interested in that experience of living in a kind of alienated state of being an artist in a city in which the kind of commerce and the industry is really about a different form, which I think also all novelists have felt for a long time around television and film and the internet and all these other narrative forms that are competing constantly with this archaic form of the novel. But, my work always grapples with questions of race and money. I think class is always at the heart of what I'm writing and how that intersects with race. And the main characters are a biracial woman who has been trying to write her people into existence for this 10-year horrifyingly long novel that she's been working on. And by existence, I mean the fact of being multiracial is often to be at odds with the kind of racial binary, the mythology of the racial binary in America. And, all of my work has been, in a sense, trying to write this experience of where I have lived in this land of crossing boundaries and crossing borders into my characters and into the worlds I describe.
Thank you. It's interesting to have a conversation about belonging right now, because we're seeing gatekeeping in action in our country, and we're in a place where I notice when I move around the island how easy things are in terms of the cross-pollination of cultures, on an island that you don't see in a lot of vacation spots, that you don't see in a lot of places. And Martha's Vineyard is a very special place for lots of reasons, but that's one of the reasons. And I want to begin with you, Joseph, because as someone who is indigenous to this rock that we all love, I want you to talk a little bit about a sense of creating a sense, striving for, trying to hold on to a sense of belonging in a place that was yours to begin with initially.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it still is, in many ways, and hopefully will continue to be. But yeah, I mean, I think creating a sense of belonging for Aquinnah-Wampanoag people, it takes a lot of different forms. Probably, for everybody up here, it's the same. But, for us, I think there have been political fights, there are cultural fights, historical fights, and all of that is coming with successes and triumphs and, steps backward and sort of lesser moments. But I think, Martha's Vineyard means so many things to so many people. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about it, and that's why we're all here and celebrating. But I think as that's evolved and as people's relationships have, new people come and these new relationships change and develop, I think for the Wampanoag people, we've just always been here. And that's, I think sometimes the confusion is that people think that that means our relationship with the place has been the same. And I think what's happened is the relationship changes, and I think it, in some ways that can be hard, but in some ways that's necessary and good. And I think, as the island has changed, the way we live on the island has changed. And, one of the things I talk about in the book is how the vast majority of the tribe does not live on the island anymore, and, let alone living in Aquinnah. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Some of it is people talk about all the time on the island, the housing crisis and the cost of living and job opportunities and these things, but also people just want to live somewhere else. I live in New York, and I like living in New York, and I don't think that takes anything away from my ability to come home and be here and participate in this work and be a part of the community. And so I think all of that, to your question, that's all part of sort of the community and collective and individual identity creation of being here from this place.
In the book, you talk about how you want people to understand the Wampanoag more. And the currency of belonging is often to be seen, heard, and valued. Not one of those things, not two of those things, but all three of those things. How does that need to happen for the Wampanoag here in Martha's Vineyard, and really throughout the United States, but most especially here on the island, because there are a lot of people who don't make their way up island. There are a lot of people who don't really understand. Maybe this book should be required reading, handed out to people as they land on the ferry or at the airport. But, I would actually be down for that. But short of that, what needs to happen so people are seen, heard, and valued?
I think, to be honest, the bar is really low. My family has a business up at the cliffs in Aquinnah, and the number of people that come in and they're like, "Who are you? Like, what tribe?" Like, Martha's Vineyard doesn't have Native people. And I think more broadly on the East Coast, the Northeast maybe in particular, is kind of, there's this, familiar narrative of we were all killed, genocide, and we're all gone, and it's over. And so I think there are these lofty places we'd like to get with sovereignty and understanding the nuances of indigenous identity and Wampanoag culture. But in many ways, we just have to start, people need to know that we're here and need to know what that comes with. And I think for people coming to the island, whether as a visitor or a resident, is, some of the complexities of Wampanoag land on the island. We have tribal land, we have land owned by individual families. The tribe is constantly trying to do new projects. There's disagreements within the tribe. There's all this complexity, and I think if you don't even know we're here, you're going to have a really hard time understanding that. And I think personally, obviously, I love the idea at the ferry, just hand it, just
have them sell them.
Sale.
Don't hand them.
Yeah. Well, they can buy a lot and then distribute.
Yes.
But I think I think it's not just me. Although I do think probably in 20 years of the book festival, probably this is the first time a Wampanoag author is up here. So, I think that's just a sign of we have a long way to go. And we do have a lot of other authors and storytellers and historians and folks in the tribe that I think people could learn a lot from.
Point of personal privilege, I'm glad you wrote about Luther. My mother loved him and his pies, and would make excuses when they were at the airport. I think we need another pie today. And Betty would make her way there. And just a note, when you talked about handing, there's actually, I don't know if you've ever been to the Iowa, where's the Iowa work? Is it Ames, Iowa? Or Cedar Rapids, Iowa? I travel in Iowa so much politically.
Iowa Writers Workshop?
Is it?
Iowa City, I believe.
They have this kiosk there that's part of the Iowa Writers Workshop that you press a button and a story comes out. It's one of the coolest things ever. And while you're waiting for your plane, you can ask for a short story or a long story. And everyone who has been through the Iowa Writers Workshop has their stories in this kiosk, and out spits a story. And it's like a CVS receipt. It's like, one of those kind of long things. You know what I'm talking about, And there's a story on it that you wind up reading in the plane. I'm speaking this into existence. It would be so cool to have vineyard stories at a kiosk. When you got off the ferry or got at so you learn a little bit about something. Martha, when you're writing about belonging and family, you're pulling everybody into the boat along with you when you're writing a story like this. It's one thing for you to go on this journey since you're writing memoir, how did you prepare the people in your family for the story that you were writing? And how did you do it in a way, because you don't land in the same place with everything that you learn. You know, you talk about hidden truths and hardened narratives, and you get to the point where you talked about love, but it sounds like you don't have, it's more complicated than just saying that you fully embrace everything that you learned. How did you get your family ready for that? And then how did you help them get to their own conclusions and feel like feel like you weren't responsible for whatever they felt about what you found in your research?
I was the person who, for a very long time, showed up at family reunions and holidays with a notebook and a pen and sort of a crude family tree, which is to say I would show up at those places and unwittingly make my family a party to this book long before there was even an idea for the book, right? That my family had always been sharing and feeding me stories. I became the person, when you finally had to close up the home of your beloved aunt, I was the one who said, I'll take those letters, right? I'll take that diary or that photo album. And I think in a way, that's the foundation, is that building that kind of trust, that you are the one, perhaps not the only one, but you are among those who really are committed to the raw artifacts, right? That evidence of family, long before you get to trying to tell the stories. You're right to make evident that love is perhaps where this book ends, but it is a trial to get there. And I think in this, I was committed, being a student of, I think, some of, my generation's, greatest memoirists, Natasha Trethewey or Casey Lehman, who really taught by their model that what memoir can be and what should be is about truth-telling and not about pretty stories. So I wade through, in particular, my own parents and their troubles. And I have to do that alone first. So I think there's a lonely phase in a book like this where you are wrestling through your own memories, your feelings about those memories, you're checking them against the stories that others share with you. There's a lot of archival work here that I'm using to, again, think critically about my own impressions. I finally gave the first talk in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and not so far from here, where much of my family lives today. And there were my cousins, 10 or 12 of them, sort of like this row here. And it was the hardest public moment, I think, of my entire...
Were they just looking at you?
Well, they were, and I would say, I think that they appeared maybe stern, but I think they were as terrified as I was about what it was like to put a family story out into the world and introduce not just us, but all of you to think about it, to think with it, to reflect on it. So I think I've been very lucky because they not only showed up, but they had questions. And so I think that it has been not the kind of collaboration where we're at the computer together or trading chapters, but that kind of family collaboration. And I'm super grateful to them for that.
You're talking about the trouble of color, the trouble of the color line, and also the trouble of people who cross the color line, and often because of love, because of relationships, and produce children who were racially ambiguous in some way.
Here we are.
Yeah.
Here we are.
And all of us on this, panel are products of adjacent to, have blended families in some way. And I don't know how many of you were here. Many of us come to the book festival over and over again, but I remember sitting in a tent when it was, I think it was across the way, but it was with Skip Gates, who declared something that kind of took the breath away from the audience. He was talking about people of color, and he said, all of us are related to most of you. You know, and the DNA proves that. There are a very small number of Africans who made their way to America. Actually, most went to South America in much larger numbers. And of that very small number, the black folk that you see today are their progeny. And often they have relations that go across the color line, but we don't talk about that. We don't talk about that. It's not like people came from Africa and just faded. You know,
No.
like, you know, the furniture in the sun or something. It just doesn't happen that way, right? But we don't talk about that, but you do in your book. And is that a necessary conversation? And would people be more interested in the issues that we tiptoe around in America if they realize that there were tethers amongst all of us? That, you know, most of you have cousins that you don't know about. And they're really interesting people, and they have really interesting histories, and maybe you would be more interested in the history that we're running away from as a country if you understood that.
Yeah, and I think I was raised by many myths about race and color, but an important one was that my parents had married across the color line in 1957, and that's why I looked the way I did, and that was a first, right? That was a first. And it turns out, as I dig deeper and deeper into the generations, I had great-great-grandparents who married across the color line in 1827, 150 years before my parents. Now, you might call that history, you might call that legacy, you might call that a lot of things, but for me, that was transformative because it helped me to think about, or to ask in a new way, so what is the American family anyway? Which is a version of Skip's point, right? That I think we're going to talk about the title for this panel a bit, but if I was raised to think that a family like mine was marginal and had been marginalized, it turned out we're the main story. This is the story of the American family. And it always has been. And this is an extraordinary panel because I think each of us in our own way, we've lived lives in which we've been understood and misunderstood, apprehended and misapprehended. And our experiences, but also the families out of which we come, you know, families of origin and families that we make, are really the main stage. And we've been fed a kind of myth that there's a pure, ideal American family. And it turns out, at least for me, that's not the story. We're not the marginalized. We're really, we're some version of the center.
I want to pick up on something you said and go to Nick, the families that we make, because James Baldwin was in the business of family making all the time. And realized that as a very young child, I mean, he was an oracle, and he was community building, and he could see things in people, and, you know, part of that was declaring himself, you know, to be a preacher as a young man, finding family in lots of ways. Could you talk a little bit about the things that we don't know about James Baldwin, because he's written about so much. I can't pick up my phone without having a James Baldwin quote come at me seemingly every day, especially right now because, as you know, it is his birthday. But there are things that you found in this. I mean, I imagined when I was reading this as you like diving into a hole with your feet up in the air, you know, like, because you just were able to uncover things that most people didn't know. So in the business of family making, were there loves of his, both familial and otherwise, that we don't know about, that we learn about in your book, that you could preview a little bit about?
Well, his biological family was, of course, very important to him. You have to look at the dedications of his books, and you see that everywhere. But less well known, and I want to tie this back to this idea of family, actually, in the way that you were speaking about it, because think about The Fire Next Time, right? That incredible, he wrote about how all Americans, black and white, are brothers and sisters, right? And, or they have to come together as lovers. So he's always using that kind of language to describe political action, actually. But guess where he wrote The Fire Next Time? Istanbul. So, and he was in Istanbul in the 60s. He went there and he finished another country there. He had to escape the nightmare that was America in order to be an artist. But when he went to these places, as close as he was to his family, he had to create new families, new kinship structures. So he was deeply embedded in this sort of Robert College intelligentsia in Istanbul, where he was friends with other American expatriates, with Turkish novelists, with all kinds of different people. So he created these artists. Sometimes they were lovers. He brought Buford Delaney, his mentor, the painter, over for a couple summers to spend time with him. So he had to kind of create these kinship structures and families that enabled him to write about the American family in all of its dysfunction, in all of its history. And at least he saw this way then, all of its possibility, if there was some kind of reckoning that we are still, of course, waiting for.
Did he, in some way, understand that he was writing for the future?
I think late in his life, it was interesting because, he was so popular and important in the public consciousness in the 60s. And then there was a decline in his reputation in the 70s and the 80s, which is part of what I try to argue against. But he was interviewed in the late 70s or early 80s in the New York Times because he'd gotten a negative review for his novel Just Above My Head, which is actually a really incredible novel. And at that point, he'd gotten very angry early in his career, and he'd written to the New York Times when they gave him a bad review for another country. But by the late 70s, he had this perspective, and he was so right. He's like, true artists are not judged in the moment of their time, they're judged later. And so I think he knew that, and I think his last play, which was never performed or really published, was called The Welcome Table. And it's about a woman sort of based on himself and sort of based on Lena Horne, who's a famous blues singer from New Orleans, and she has a house in the south of France, just like he has, and a cast of friends and lovers just like he had. And and her career was sort of going down the hill. There's a Skip Gates character that shows up, who's a reporter coming to interview him. And he was also very, very targeted in who he chose to be his assistant and write his first incredibly important, not the first, but really important biography by David Leeming that Knopf published in 1994. This was his personal assistant and friend, and he authorized him to do it because he did understand legacy, and he did understand that people were going to write things about him that were not true, and they were writing things about him that were not true. So I think he was very aware of it.
I'm going to keep speaking the things into existence that I want to see on this place that we love. The welcome table is an idea, and I think you probably know this, that has been picked up. There are welcome tables around the country. Mitch Landrieu does them in New Orleans, where he brings people together, and when people call you to dinner in New Orleans, you always come, because the food is always great. But the idea is he brings people who don't normally get along with each other, who maybe don't know each other, together for the welcome table, puts an issue on the table and says, y'all are going to talk about this. Another idea that would be really cool to do here on the Vineyard at some point. Danzy, you put a lot of yourself into your work. And when you do that, your work is often about belonging and trying to, living in liminal spaces.
Yes.
Where you're a foot in both worlds, but never fully existing in both. And in this novel, there's someone who talks to Jane and says, "Oh, you're writing another book."
Another book about mulattoes.
Yes, about mulattoes, which is I want to ask you about mulattoes, a phrase that you embrace in the book.
Yeah.
And I love your description of Brooklyn and the sort of spinster mulattoes in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
The book is very funny, and the
Yes.
use of humor to make very observant, very cutting observations. But is there something in that? Have you had that conversation where people are saying, "Oh, here you go, writing about race again"? And was that a way to push back against that? And how do you make a decision about how much of yourself that you put in your books when you're writing about belonging and when you're writing about living in that sort of liminal space?
Yeah. So I published my first novel, Caucasia, in the late 90s. And I was born in 1970. And I feel like I've watched black, white, biracial people. I feel very old when I talk about it because I've watched us change our name or have different names projected onto us. I've watched us move through many different iterations. And I loved hearing you talk because your parents were really ahead of the the trend. And my parents were married in 1968, and it was the beginning of a sort of baby boom. It was the first, legalized interracial marriages, Loving versus State of Virginia. And I grew up with a lot of other mixed race people who were my parents' friends' children around me. But I've watched, even today, I'm kind of fascinated by the kind of change in how people of mixed race are become this site of anxiety in the culture. And when I was growing up, the pressure was, the Black Power movement was in full effect, and the pressure on me in particular was from my parents, who were very politicized, was like, don't you dare pass as white. You are a Black girl growing up in America, and I went to Afrocentric school, and I was seeped in the language of Black pride and Black power, and that in recent years has become like a controversial thing to present to the world as white, but to identify as Black. And so I feel like I'm often doing a kind of history lesson for people who don't understand the context in which that identity came to be, and that it wasn't just about the one-drop rule, that Blackness was actually a political identity at that time, and a kind of pushback against all the messages you would get particularly in Boston in the 1970s, if anyone here knows that history. So I feel really grateful that I grew up with that, but because of the way I am perceived, I do live in that liminal space, and that is central to some of the, everything I write. And when I wrote Caucasia, I published this first novel about a girl who was mixed race in the 70s in Boston, and the first comment I got from my publishers afterward was, now you can just move on from the race thing. And it was actually, the pressure was, now you get to be a white girl. And they thought it was like a one-time deal and didn't understand how baked into my view of the universe American history is, and how much the problem, the trouble of race is to my identity and to my family as it continues to emerge, and how it's never the past. It is present, and it's, as we see it, every time we think we're post-racial, it's like, ha ha, no you're not. But I'm interested also in the political possibilities of living in that liminal space, and how that can either be this sort of kumbaya nothingness, or it can be an actual opportunity to understand in your discomfort that there is no us and there is no them. And I'm especially aware of that right now with what's happening in Gaza. The idea that that anyone could think so deeply about themselves as part of a tribe or a people that they would fail to see the humanity of children being slaughtered in front of them. It's like the sort of logical conclusion of that idea of us and them, that I am in a family of people who are all different religions, all different histories, all coming together, and we don't have that privilege. And I think that's one of the real radical possibilities of sitting in that space of in-between.
We're living. We're living in a moment of what one social scientist calls themification.
Yeah.
Where the idea that there is no us but them, but no, the word them now is capitalized in bold, and we see it in public policy. We see it in rollbacks of progress that are disappearing in the way that South Beach is gone. Just to draw a local analogy. And if you've been to South Beach, you have a visual image of what I'm talking about. It's just not there anymore. And it's happening very quickly. I don't want to have this conversation about belonging without addressing what's happening in America right now. What are we losing? Help us understand, not just through metaphor, but what is being snatched from us right now, what's at stake, and what can people do if they feel like if you believe that progress is being snatched. Some people are actually A-okay with what's happening, and they are okay with it. If you are feeling like something is moving in the wrong direction, what needs to happen?
I think the babies answer. I feel what the baby
The
feels.
whale.
Yeah.
I can start because, my stock and trade is in the archive, is in research, is in the hands of the archivist and the librarian, the custodians, right, of our past in its most raw form. Writing a family memoir, means clawing through those materials, searching, hunting for clues, right, about your people. But you do so always, as we say, standing on the shoulders, right, of the folks who are running our cultural institutions and our repositories. So how threatening, how profound, what is at stake when we, and I say we in the most collective sense, are watching those institutions be undone, unfunded. The beloved Amistad Research Center in New Orleans. For a very long time in this country, there were only 3 institutions that valued and collected and preserved the African American past: the Schomburg in New York, the Moreland Spingarn Library at Howard University, and the Amistad in New Orleans. Well, as I understand it today, the Amistad has had to close, right, to the regular researcher, right, the visitor, whether they're writing, the Pulitzer history or that important family genealogy. That place isn't open to us. And so what is at risk, right? It is our ability to know our past and then to narrate it. And I would say that's not only about storytelling, though I'm with these extraordinary storytellers, that is about power, right? The power of our ability to tell our story. And
Nick, I want you to take this on also as that 8th grader who saw James Baldwin on the wall, because James Baldwin's books are being snatched out of schools right now, and so an 8th grader today might not have that experience.
That's right. I was, as you were speaking, Martha, I was thinking, we have to write them and people have to read them. It was Baldwin who said, it was reading that made him realize that he was connected to everybody in the world. So the banning of the books, obviously, is a massive problem that we have to fight against. It's connected to, we can write them, but if they're banned, how do you read them? I think with Baldwin, these kinds of questions are really tricky. I'm always wary to say, well, this is what Baldwin would have said, right? Because he was idiosyncratic, and he would not always say what you thought he was going to say. He did have stuff to say about Gaza, for example, right? Really interesting. He showed to me, it's a longer story, but he went there. He went to Jerusalem. He went to Gaza. This was in the 50s, and he changed his mind about how he felt about the conflict there. He did not understand it the first time he went there, because he read more and he talked more to people. And I think that's what we're trying to do as writers and readers and as people coming together, is having these kinds of conversations. It's our only hope.
When someone tells you, when you tell someone one of your books has been banned, do you find that people say, like, right on, good for you? Wrong response.
it's incredible.
It's like radical chic or something.
Yeah.
I mean, we have to. I don't remember the line. I've been thinking about Michele Obama saying to us, like, things could get a lot worse to us. Remember that speech? And I was like, oh, this is what she was talking about. Like, things we couldn't imagine are happening right now. And it's on a global scale that we're kind of, and Naomi Klein talks about shock and awe and the strategy of just putting one bad thing after another.
Exhaustion is
that
is
we
the
will
strategy.
shut down, and that is what we have to kind of fight against. And I think Baldwin is, one of those voices we have to keep returning to, because he was a seer and he saw things and changed his mind.
Yeah.
We have to be willing to do that too.
He changed his mind. He changed his mind when it came to gender, for example, later in his life. He began to see, he wrote not some such great things, or weird conversations with some black feminists. And then they changed his mind. He wrote, If Beale Street Could Talk, he wrote from the perspective of a woman. Yeah. He started to see himself as in some ways androgynous. His last essay, he wrote about androgyny. I mean, that's important to remember. We can't put Baldwin up on a big poster and a static soundbite, because he himself was constantly shifting, and thank goodness, right? All of us should be.
In reading that, I was wondering if he would be pilloried today. He flip-flopped, he changed his mind, that people live in sort of fixed boxes and not able to step out of them in the same way. Baldwin, my favorite Baldwin quote, and I'm going to butcher it, but it was essentially, you have to decide who you are and figure out how to be who you are despite what the world sees you as. Like, you have to live in your truth, and the world will figure it out, not you. Harder to do right now. So how do we interrogate something like that, which meant something very different? I'm ashamed that I can't remember the quote, because I've given it to my kids, all four of them. And they look at it now and they say, how do we do this in this moment? It's a lot more difficult. Joseph?
We've been talking before we came up here about the title of this panel, the Out of Place in America, and I think we probably all have varying feelings of whether we are or are not out of place in America. But I mean, I think the part of this question is like, out of place in America, like, says who, right? And I think we can talk all about how we feel about identity and who we are and how we feel we belong in America, and how certainly I feel I belong on Martha's Vineyard, definitely. But I think the other side of that coin is, well, who's making us out of place in America? Or what are the forces at work here that are saying you're not in America, or that are forcing, taking your books out of the library, or saying, these people can't marry, or, your identity is not what you say it is. So I think it's like we have to talk about that side of the thing as much as we're talking about, kind of pushing back against that thing. And I think that's the same conversation, but it's different parts of it. And yeah, so to the Baldwin point, I think, we're defining our own identities and navigating this all together. But I think the question of, who's on the other side of that's something we'll have to reckon with. And to your previous question about, like, well, what can we do? I mean, I think that's what we can do. And, in the context of Martha's Vineyard in particular, and if we're talking about the Wampanoag people, I think it's easy to look at these bigger national things and feel like, what's happening with Indigenous history across the country, or what's happening with Department of Interior, or, like, what's RFK doing with Indian Health Services? And these are all real things, but I think for most of us, certainly for me, you can't really touch those. We just don't have access to that. But, there are local things here on Martha's Vineyard, or probably if you're from somewhere else where you live, that, Indigenous people are dealing with these issues of land. And along with that is the same questions of belonging that I think we're all up here talking about. So I think, that's the work.
Yeah, and sometimes I belong is a full sentence. It doesn't need anything else. Period, exclamation point. I'd like to bring in the audience, if we could. Do we have a microphone that we can get to the gentleman in?
I think they're supposed to come up.
Can you come forward? Would that be okay? Or can you pass? Might be.
Here.
Thank you. We can get it to you, sir. Can you read?
Name is Jules Bernstein. A simple question. The title of his book was The Fire Next Time. Is the fire on right now? My view is yes, but I'd like to hear how the panelists think about it.
It's for you.
Get us started.
Yes.
I think that's it. I think, would everyone concur? Does anyone else have?
Well, I also think, though, that, this is a particularly extreme moment in many ways, but like during the sort of summer of George Floyd, I would have people say to me, wow, your work, it must be interesting to have your work come into such relevance. And I was like, Blackness, identity, race has been central to the American story, and the kind of violence of race and the violence of racism, all of these things have been here forever. And so I think part of that is like about history and the stories that we tell and the stories that the news reports, that just because something hasn't been foregrounded doesn't mean that, especially the people who have been marginalized, that hasn't been the fire the whole time. So I think that we're living in maybe a bit bigger flame at the moment, but this fire has been here from the beginning, and yeah.
Yeah, and what can be, for me, really emboldening about a long family history is recognizing that we have been
Here before.
in the fire,
Yeah.
and we know the fire, and gathering up the ancestors and their wisdom, right, for our own time, I think is part of our work, is not to think that everything that challenges us in this moment is unprecedented and unknown and un-American. It's terribly known, terribly precedented, and terribly American. It has its own contours, right, its own particulars. But for me, I think it's been important to remember that we have been here, so many of us and so many of our families, the places and the people we come from, have been through the trials. And I hope they're with us, keeping us company in this moment.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. We're going to go over here.
Okay, just making sure it's on. Thank you so much. I am, speaking of being in the fire, I am an anti-racist activist in the South, specifically about the removal of Confederate monuments in the Southeast. And as such, a conversation that I've had hundreds and hundreds of times is white people coming up to me and announcing, well, my family never owned slaves. But a conversation I have not had is white people owning up to me that, in fact, I am descended from enslaving people, which I am, and I have always known that, and that has always hung over me my entire life. And that actually has shaped the course of my life to a great degree. And because of those experiences as an activist, I began to realize that rather than pushing it away, it's very important to tell these kinds of stories and to dig back. So my question is most specifically for Martha, because as I began to dig back, the first ancestor I found was the eugenicist Aubrey Ellis Strode, who authored the Racial Integrity Act of Virginia in 1924. My great uncle, Aubrey Ellis Strode. And so I'm not feeling the love. And so I feel like my experience is the opposite in a way, or inversion of yours, in that my parents are the ones that I can celebrate for breaking the cycle and sending us to public school in North Carolina in the 70s, and for really raising us in a different way. But as I go further back, it's like I'm not finding the love. I'm not finding myself able to write out of love. And so I'm just asking how maybe to do that, to try that. Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you, very much for sharing that part of your story and inviting all of us, to think with our own families. I came because there are, it perhaps won't surprise anyone, there are many so-called white people on my family tree. But I began to think of a difference between, the relations of blood and DNA and the relations of kin and family. And what fascinated me and really drew me to writing a family story was not to argue with the past. Right? I have black forebears for whom those slaveholding men were grandfather, and they called them grandfather, understood them as grandfather. To me, grandfather is an honorific, right? And I could never bestow that on those same men. But rather than try and resolve that, my question was to try and understand how family stories change over time, which is to say, our own stories are 21st century stories with their own integrity, and there is a way in which a 19th century story also has its own integrity, but it doesn't have to be ours, and I don't think we're obliged to reconcile those things, even as I think we learn from the ways in which our ideas about family have changed. So I would say stay with precisely who you are and how you understand family and kin and who can be and who cannot be. But I don't think your assignment is necessarily to change and rewrite the past.
That's a beautiful,
Yeah.
beautiful answer. We're often known in this country. In this country, we are often known for revolutions as opposed to evolutions. And we often find strength and certainly beauty in evolution, and maybe leaning into that. Because we're at the end of our time, we're going to do something a little unusual. We have two people, one at each side. I'd like you both to ask your quick question, and then we're going to try to bundle them and get answers. So, sir, you're going to go first.
Yeah, great panel. Thank you. My granddaughter has hair like Mr. Boggs. So first question is to Mr. Lee. Can you talk a little bit about the intersection between and relationship between the longtime generational African American community up here in the Wampanoags and the Wampanoag tribe and the Wampanoag people and personal relationships, etc. And to Mr. Boggs, can you give us any antidotes on the famous Buckley Baldwin debate?
Yeah. Okay, we'll hold on that for just a second.
One more.
As an amateur student of psychology, I just am wondering, listening to this, about what is the origin of even the concept of identity? Is it ancient? Is it Freudian? Like, when did we start being concerned about what is identity?
Okay, we'll try to do that.
in 2
We'll do a 6-part series on that later. But for now, we'll
Michele, next summer, for next summer.
okay. But first, the questions for Joseph and Nicholas, and then we'll have time to think about the origins of identity.
I want Joseph to go last.
Okay.
So I'm just going to say my antidote to the Buckley situation is to barely write about it in the book, because I feel like it's been covered extensively. There's a whole book about it, and I just felt like there's something about the spectacle of Baldwin as the only black man in this situation that people are really, really drawn to, that he actually writes about himself in Stranger in the Village. So I spent a lot of time with that essay, with his time in Switzerland, what that meant to him. And I mentioned the Buckley, but there's plenty of other places to go for that.
Okay, Joseph.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think in so many ways it's a linked history. I mean, black folks who come here in the summer will understand that when they say they go to Martha's Vineyard, sometimes people are like, isn't that, not for you? And it's exactly the same thing that we hear up here, even on our own lands, is like, you don't really fit in with what I thought Martha's Vineyard was. And I think that's just, if you look back through the history, that's one of many, many, many intersections between our histories, going back to, before the Civil War, through the World Wars, and there's so many intersections. And I think in many ways that's one of the beautiful and special things about these two communities here that are linked in so many ways. And if you look at our tribe too, we're very racially, family-wise, the way we look, we're a very diverse tribe. And I think that's also part of that legacy and the legacy of the vineyard. And I know we have to go, so we could talk about it more after if you want to, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Anyone have a last word on identity?
Oh, I was just going to speak to the woman whose ancestry was problematic. I was just going to say that our ancestry can't save us, whether it's a noble history, and it can't condemn us, and we really don't have time to be paralyzed by guilt. And that, all of us have a responsibility to the present, and that sense of being, I have slave owners and enslaved people in my history, and I think that's what we've been writing about, is how we're all linked. But I think that that kind of guilt or sense of being paralyzed by the past is, we just don't have time for that now. We have some much bigger problems we have to solve about the future. Yeah.
This has been a wonderful panel. When it comes to identity, I think it's just important for us to remember that the I in America includes all of us.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michele. You're such a pro. It's like, oh my God.